Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine struggling to buy diapers for your newborn while your dad gifts your sister a luxury car without a second thought. Now imagine him showing up years later, asking to reconnect as if nothing ever happened. It was an ordinary afternoon, and I was taking a rare moment to relax on the couch while Ethan napped in his bassinet. I decided to scroll through social media, something I barely had time for these days. That's when I saw it. A picture of Rachel standing next to a sleek, brand-new luxury car. Her caption read, "Thanks, Dad. You're the best." For a moment, I stared at the screen, blinking. Rachel and I were only 2 years apart, but our lives couldn't have been more different. While she worked a cushy office job and traveled to tropical destinations for fun, I was working two part-time jobs just to keep diapers and formula in the house. Seeing her with that car, a car that looked like it cost more than I made in a year, made my chest tighten. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she bought it herself. Rachel was always good at saving money, and she'd been talking about upgrading her car for a while. But the caption gnawed at me. "Thanks, Dad." What kind of father gives one kid a luxury car while the other is drowning in bills? I couldn't let it go. I called her, trying to keep my tone casual. "Hey, Rachel, I saw your post. Is that really your car?" She laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Yeah, it's mine. Isn't it amazing? Dad gave it to me as a gift." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "A gift?" I repeated, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "He just gave it to you?" "Yep," she said, completely unfazed. "He said I deserve something nice for all my hard work. He's the best, isn't he?" I couldn't respond. My throat felt tight, and my mind was racing. I ended the call as quickly as I could without raising suspicion. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Emma was asleep, I finally called my dad. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't thought of. "Hey, Dad," I began, trying to sound neutral. "I saw Rachel's new car. She said you gave it to her?" He chuckled, like I'd asked him about a new pair of shoes instead of a car that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. "Yeah, she needed something reliable. Her old car was giving her trouble." I felt a knot in my stomach tighten. "And you just bought it for her? A luxury car?" "It's not like I bought her a house," he said, his tone dismissive. "She's been working so hard. I thought she deserved something nice." I stared at the wall, the phone pressed to my ear. Meanwhile, I just spent my last $20 on diapers and formula, and he thought Rachel deserved a luxury car for working hard? "I'm working hard too," I said, my voice low but steady. "Emma and I are struggling to make ends meet, and I'm working two jobs. We can barely afford groceries. But you haven't offered to help us. Not even once." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he sighed. "Son, you chose to have a family. That was your decision. Rachel's situation is different." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Different? How? Because she's single and doesn't have kids? That doesn't mean she needs a car more than I need help keeping the lights on. "Look," he said, his tone growing impatient. "I've helped you plenty of times before. I'm not going to apologize for doing something nice for your sister." "Plenty of times?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean letting me mow your lawn as a kid for $10? Or those times you handed me $20 and told me to make it stretch?" "Yeah. Thanks for all that help, Dad." "Watch your tone," he snapped. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Rachel needed the car, and I had the means to help. End of story." I hung up the phone without another word. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt tight with anger. For years, I tried to ignore the favoritism, telling myself that maybe I was imagining it. But this was undeniable. As I sat there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder, was I being unreasonable? Or was my dad really choosing Rachel over me, over my family? And if so, what did that mean for our relationship moving forward? Life had been tough for Emma and me even before Ethan was born. We had always gotten by, but getting by had taken on a whole new meaning with a newborn in the picture. The steady stream of diapers, formula, and baby supplies felt endless, and no matter how hard I worked, the bills seemed to pile up faster than I could pay them. I had taken on a second job delivering groceries, working late into the night after finishing my regular shift at the hardware store. Emma had taken time off from her job to recover and care for Ethan, and while I knew it was the best thing for both of them, it left us without her paycheck. Every dollar was stretched to its limit, and still, it never felt like enough. One evening, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, Emma and I sat at the kitchen table counting the coins from our emergency jar. We were trying to scrape together enough to buy a pack of diapers and maybe a few groceries to get us through the week. The soft glow of the kitchen light highlighted the worry lines on Emma's face, lines that hadn't been there a year ago. As she sorted through the coins, she looked up at me hesitantly. "Have you thought about asking your dad for help?" I snorted, shaking my head. "You mean the same dad who just handed Rachel the keys to a brand new car?" "Yeah, I'm sure he'd love to hear about our struggles." Emma sighed, leaning back in her chair. It's not fair, you know. We're over here barely keeping our heads above water, and he's out there spoiling Rachel like she's the only one that matters." I couldn't argue with her. It wasn't fair. It was like my dad had blinders on when it came to Rachel. She was always his favorite, the one he bragged about to his friends, the one he went out of his way to help. Meanwhile, I was left to fend for myself, no matter how hard things got. The unfairness of it all weighed on me as I stared at the small pile of coins on the table. It wasn't enough to buy everything we needed, but it would have to do. I grabbed my wallet and keys, ready to make a late-night run to the store. "I'll be back soon," I said, kissing Emma on the forehead. As I drove to the store, my mind wandered back to the conversation with my dad. His words echoed in my head. "I'm not responsible for your choices." Choices? Was that all Ethan was to him? A choice I had made? Did he really not see how much we were struggling? Or did he just not care? When I got home, Emma was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her expression a mix of exhaustion and concern. "Did you get everything we needed?" she asked. "Just the diapers," I said, holding up the bag. "We'll have to figure out the rest later." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to me. As I sat down next to her, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of resentment toward my dad. He had the means to help us. He made that clear by gifting Rachel a luxury car, but he chose not to. Instead, he left us to struggle, as if our problems were entirely of our own making. I tried to push the anger aside, to focus on the little victories like the fact that we'd managed to get Ethan everything he needed so far. But the bitterness lingered, a constant reminder of how alone we were in this fight. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought that kept nagging at me. What would it take for my dad to see me as worthy of his help? And why, after all these years, did I still feel like I had to prove myself to him? The answers weren't coming anytime soon, but one thing was clear. If I wanted things to change, I couldn't keep sitting around waiting for my dad to step up. I had to find a way to move forward, without him, if necessary. The family barbecue was supposed to be a casual get-together, but for me, it felt like walking into a battlefield. Emma and I had borrowed my uncle's old minivan to make it to my parents' house, and its sputtering engine was a constant reminder of how tight things were for us. As we pulled into the driveway, Rachel arrived at the same time in her shiny new car. She honked the horn playfully and waved at me through the window, her sunglasses perched on her nose like she'd just stepped off the cover of a magazine. When she parked, a small crowd of relatives gathered around her, marveling at the car as if it were some mythical creature. "Isn't it amazing?" Rachel said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Dad's the best. I couldn't have asked for a better gift." I clenched my jaw and tried to focus on unloading the diaper bag and stroller from the minivan. Ethan fussed in Emma's arms, and she gave me a sympathetic look. "We'll get through this," she whispered. But her words did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. For the next hour, I forced myself to play along. I smiled when people commented on how much Ethan had grown, nodded politely during conversations, and pretended not to notice when Rachel brought up her car at every opportunity. But the resentment was bubbling just beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I snapped. Finally, I saw my chance. My dad was standing by the grill, flipping burgers away from the rest of the crowd. I walked up to him, my heart pounding. "Dad, can we talk?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sure, what's up?" I gestured toward a quieter part of the yard, away from prying ears. He followed me, wiping his hands on a towel as we walked. Once we were out of earshot, I didn't waste any time. "Why did you give Rachel a car?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. His expression shifted to one of mild annoyance. "Because she needed it," he said simply. "Her old car was falling apart. She works hard and deserves something nice." I felt my anger flare. "And I don't work hard?" I shot back. "I'm working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, and struggling to keep a roof over my family's head. But you've never offered to help us. Not once." He sighed, like he was tired of the conversation before it had even started. "Son, Rachel's in a different place in her life. She doesn't have a family to support, so she has the freedom to focus on herself. It's not the same." "Not the same?" I repeated, my voice rising. You think that makes her more deserving of your help? Do you have any idea what Emma and I have been going through? We're counting coins to buy diapers while you're out here handing Rachel the keys to a luxury car. I'm not responsible for your choices, he said flatly. You decided to have a family. That was your decision, and it comes with responsibilities. I'm not obligated to bail you out. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Bail me out? I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. I'm not asking for a handout, Dad. I'm asking why you think Rachel's wants are more important than my family's needs. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said, shaking his head. It's not like I bought her a house. It's just a car. Just a car? I said bitterly. It's a car that could pay for a year's worth of diapers, formula, and medical bills for Ethan. Do you even realize how much of a difference that money could make for us? He folded his arms, his jaw set. I've helped you before, he said defensively. I've given you advice, taught you how to work hard. You're an adult now. You need to take responsibility for your own life. I laughed bitterly. Advice? That's what you think counts as help? Meanwhile, Rachel gets whatever she wants handed to her on a silver platter. How is that fair? Life's not fair, he said with a shrug. You can't expect me to solve all your problems. I stared at him, disbelief and anger swirling inside me. You know what, Dad? You're right. I can't expect anything from you. And that's the saddest part of all. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, my hands shaking with frustration. Emma saw me coming and gave me a questioning look, but I shook my head, signaling that I didn't want to talk about it. Not here, not now. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't help but glance at Rachel's car one last time. The shiny paint gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the old, dented minivan we were borrowing. Driving home that day, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. My dad's words kept echoing in my mind. I'm not responsible for your choices. Was that all Ethan and I were to him? Choices he didn't agree with? It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep hoping for my dad to change. If I wanted a better life for my family, I'd have to make it happen on my own. The conversation with my dad lingered in my mind, growing darker and heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the car or his dismissive attitude. It was the realization that his favoritism had always been there, woven into the fabric of our family dynamics. The memories came rushing back like a flood. I couldn't stop. I thought about the expensive dance classes Rachel got when we were kids, complete with custom costumes and travel to competitions. Meanwhile, when I asked to join the football team, Dad said it was too costly and that I should focus on something practical, like mowing lawns to earn extra money. Then there were the trips. Rachel always got to go. Ski weekends, trips to Disney World, even a cruise once, but I stayed home. Someone needs to take care of the house, Dad would say, as if a 14-year-old was the natural choice for that responsibility. I'd babysit the neighbors' kids to earn spending money while Rachel got new outfits for every trip. At the time, I thought it was normal, but now it felt like a series of small cuts that had never fully healed. All of those memories bubbled to the surface one night when Ethan got sick. He'd been fussier than usual all day, running a low fever and refusing to eat. By bedtime, his fever had spiked, and Emma and I were frantic. We ended up taking him to the emergency room, terrified that it might be something serious. After a long, sleepless night, the doctors assured us that Ethan would be okay. It was just a nasty virus, but they recommended a follow-up with his pediatrician and some medication to manage his symptoms. Relieved but exhausted, we brought him home and collapsed into bed, only to wake up a few hours later to the sound of his cries. As the days went on, the medical bills started piling up. Between the ER visit, the prescriptions, and the follow-up appointments, we were drowning. I tried picking up extra hours at work, but it wasn't enough. Emma looked pale and worn down, the stress of it all etched into her face. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of bills, Emma reached across and took my hand. You have to call him, she said softly. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Emma, just try, she said, her voice trembling. Maybe this time he'll understand. Maybe he'll help. Reluctantly, I picked up my phone and dialed his number. It rang a few times before he answered, his voice as casual as ever. Hey, son, what's up? I swallowed my pride and got straight to the point. Ethan's been sick, I said, my voice tight. We've had to take him to the ER and the doctor, and now we've got all these bills piling up. We're really struggling, Dad. Can you help us out? There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I let myself hope that he might actually come through this time. But then he spoke, and his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I've already done enough for you, he said flatly. You're an adult now. It's time to stand on your own 2 feet. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone pressed to my ear. You've already done enough? I repeated, my voice shaking. Dad, I'm asking for help for your grandson. This isn't about me. It's about Ethan. I understand that, he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. But I can't keep bailing you out every time you hit a rough patch. You need to figure this out on your own. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Bailing me out? When have you ever bailed me out, Dad? You gave Rachel a car, for God's sake. I'm just asking for a little help with medical bills, and you're acting like I'm asking for a handout. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said, his voice clipped. But I stand by what I said. You need to take responsibility for your own life. I hung up the phone without saying another word. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. Emma was watching me, her eyes wide with worry. What did he say? I shook my head, barely able to speak. He said he's done enough for us. We're on our own. She reached for my hand, her own trembling. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice filled with a mix of determination and heartbreak. But in that moment, I knew I was done. I couldn't keep hoping for something that was never going to come. My dad had made his priorities clear, and I wasn't one of them. That night, as I sat by Ethan's crib watching him sleep, I made a decision. I couldn't rely on my dad, and I didn't want to. If he didn't want to be part of our lives, that was his choice. But from now on, I was done trying to make him see me. It was time to let go of the fantasy of the father I'd always wanted and focus on being the father Ethan needed. The day after that phone call, I sat in silence, letting the weight of my decision settle over me. Cutting ties with my dad wasn't something I ever thought I'd have to do. He was supposed to be a source of support, the person I could count on when life got hard. But after years of disappointment, I realized I'd been holding onto an illusion. It was time to let go for my sake and for my family's. Emma supported me completely, even though she knew the decision would make things harder for us. That night, as we sat on the couch with Ethan sleeping in his bassinet, she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice steady. We always do. Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the sting of rejection. Still, I knew she was right. We had gotten through so much already, and we'd keep pushing forward without my dad. Not everyone in the family understood my decision. Rachel, for one, couldn't seem to wrap her head around it. She called me a week later, her voice chipper but edged with a hint of unease. Hey, have you talked to Dad lately? She asked, as if we hadn't just gone through the most painful conversation of my life. No, I said flatly. She hesitated for a moment before launching into her usual spiel. He feels really bad, you know. He's been talking about how he wishes things could go back to normal. I laughed bitterly. If he feels bad, he has a funny way of showing it. Telling me to figure it out on my own doesn't exactly scream regret. You know how he is, Rachel said, her tone taking on that familiar patronizing edge. He's not great at expressing himself, but he loves you. Does he? I shot back, because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like I've been second place my whole life, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Rachel sighed. I just think you should give him another chance. He's still your dad, and I'm still his son, I said, my voice sharp. But that hasn't stopped him from putting you first every time. I'm done, Rachel. I can't keep setting myself up for disappointment. She didn't argue after that, but the tension between us lingered. Over time, Emma and I adjusted to life without him. It wasn't easy, but it was liberating in a way. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring, stopped hoping for some grand gesture of reconciliation that would never come. Letting go of those expectations felt like shedding a heavy weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The absence of my dad's presence forced me to focus on what truly mattered, my family. I threw myself into being the best husband and father I could be. I picked up extra shifts at work, started budgeting more carefully, and made sure to spend every free moment with Ethan and Emma. Something incredible happened during that time. Without the constant disappointment of my dad hanging over me, I started to feel a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Ethan was thriving, hitting all his milestones and filling our days with laughter. Emma and I grew closer, leaning on each other in a way that strengthened our relationship. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Cutting ties with my dad hadn't been easy, but it had been the right decision. I didn't need his approval, his help, or his validation to be happy. Of course, there were moments when I missed the idea of what our relationship could have been. I thought about the father I'd wanted growing up, the one who would have cheered me on at football games, taught me how to fix a car, or shown up for me when I needed him most. But I realized that person didn't exist. My dad was who he was, and I couldn't change that. What I could do was break the cycle. I made a promise to myself that Ethan would never feel the way I had. He would know, without a doubt, that he was loved and supported. I couldn't rewrite my own story, but I could make sure his was different. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Years passed, and my life moved forward without my dad in it. Rachel would occasionally send me updates about him, how he'd been traveling, how he was thinking about retirement, or how he'd recently renovated his house. But I didn't ask for these updates, and I didn't offer much in return. She learned to drop the subject quickly when she saw I wasn't interested. During those years, life wasn't easy, but it was good. Ethan grew into a happy, energetic toddler, filling our days with chaos and joy. Emma went back to work part-time, and with my promotions at the hardware store, we finally began to feel stable. We'd saved enough to trade in the old minivan for a reliable used car, and for the first time, we weren't living paycheck to paycheck. One crisp fall afternoon, I was in the backyard raking leaves while Ethan played with a toy truck nearby. Emma was inside making tea, and I was enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the day when I heard the doorbell ring. I didn't think much of it until I saw Emma come out to the porch, her face pale. "Someone's here to see you," she said, her voice laced with unease. I walked to the front door and froze when I saw him. My dad stood on the doorstep, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, looking older and smaller than I remembered. The lines on his face were deeper, his hair grayer, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The awkward silence stretched between us until he finally cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Every instinct told me to say no, to slam the door and go back to my peaceful afternoon. But there was something about the way he looked, vulnerable, almost desperate, that stopped me. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. He stepped inside cautiously, as if he didn't quite belong. The house was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea Emma had been brewing. He glanced around, taking in the family photos on the wall and the toys scattered on the floor. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. He looked down at his hands, fumbling for words. "I want to reconnect," he said finally. "I miss my family." I folded my arms, leaning against the wall. "Your family?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "You mean the one you told to figure it out on their own? The one you walked away from when we needed you most?" He winced at my words, but he didn't argue. "I know I've made mistakes," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about how I let things get so bad between us. And I want to fix it. Fix it?" I said, shaking my head. "Dad, you can't just show up after all these years and expect things to go back to normal. That's not how this works." "I'm not expecting that," he said quickly. I want a chance to make things right. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I realize now that I should have been there for you more. For all of you." I let out a bitter laugh. "It took you this long to figure that out?" He nodded, his face full of regret. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, "but I'm asking for a chance to earn it." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to tell him he was too late and that we didn't need him anymore. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the dad who used to read me bedtime stories and cheer for me in my Little League games, felt a flicker of curiosity. "I don't know if I can do that," I said honestly. He nodded again, as if he'd expected that answer. "I understand," he said, his voice soft. "But I hope you'll think about it. I miss you, son. I miss all of you." Before I could respond, Ethan ran into the room, clutching his toy truck and babbling excitedly. He stopped short when he saw my dad, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. My dad's face softened as he knelt down to Ethan's level. "Hey there," he said gently. "You must be Ethan." Ethan nodded, clutching his truck tightly. "Who are you?" he asked, tilting his head. "I'm your grandpa," my dad said, his voice thick with emotion. The sight of them together, the man I'd spent years resenting and the boy who was my whole world, hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't ready to forgive my dad, but I couldn't deny that part of me wanted to believe he was sincere. "Thanks for stopping by," I said finally, my tone carefully neutral. "I'll think about what you said." He stood slowly, his eyes lingering on Ethan for a moment before he turned back to me. "That's all I'm asking," he said. After he left, I stood by the window, watching him walk to his car. Emma came up behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think I need to figure it out, for Ethan's sake if nothing else." The unexpected visit had shaken something loose in me, stirring up emotions I thought I'd buried long ago. Whether or not I could forgive my dad was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. A few days after my dad's unexpected visit, I called him and suggested we meet. I wasn't entirely sure why I agreed to see him again. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the look on Ethan's face when he heard the word Grandpa. Either way, I found myself sitting across from my dad in my living room, Emma keeping her distance in the kitchen to give us privacy. The silence between us was heavy, neither of us knowing quite where to start. Finally, he cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "About you, about us, and about the kind of father I've been." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know I wasn't fair to you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I see that now. I thought I was doing what was best, teaching you to be independent, to work hard, but I realize now that I didn't do enough to show you that I was in your corner." His words were a start, but they didn't erase years of hurt. "Why now?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Why are you suddenly sorry after all this time?" He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. "Because I'm getting older," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I don't want to leave this world with regrets. You're my son, and I want to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm hoping it's not too late to start over." I wanted to believe him, to take his words at face value. But I couldn't forget all the times he'd let me down, how he'd dismissed my struggles, favored Rachel, and left me to fend for myself when I needed him most. "Do you even know how much you hurt me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "All those years of watching you go out of your way for Rachel, while I had to scrape by on my own? And then when I finally swallowed my pride and asked for your help, you told me to figure it out myself. Do you know what that felt like?" Tears filled his eyes, and he nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how much I hurt you," he admitted. "I was blind to it. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I failed you. And I'm so sorry." His apology felt sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough to erase the pain. "You say you're sorry," I said, "but sorry doesn't fix what's broken. It doesn't change the fact that I spent years feeling like I wasn't good enough for you." He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, raw vulnerability. "You're right," he said softly. "Sorry isn't enough. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, and I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I just want a chance to earn your trust again." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" He hesitated, as if he hadn't thought that far ahead. "By being here," he said finally. "By showing you that I've changed. I can't undo the past, but I can show you that I want to be better. For you, for Emma, and for Ethan." The mention of Ethan made me pause. My dad had never been a part of his life, and I convinced myself that Ethan didn't need him. But as I watched my dad sitting there, his eyes filled with regret, I wondered if it was fair to deny Ethan the chance to know his grandfather. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I'm just asking for a chance to try." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I thought about the years of resentment, the disappointment that had built up like a wall between us. Letting him back into my life wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't even sure if it was the right decision. But as I glanced at the family photo on the wall, me, Emma, and Ethan smiling together, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about him. It was about me, about letting go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. He nodded, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "That's all I can ask." As he stood to leave, I walked him to the door, the tension between us slightly less heavy than before. Watching him drive away, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and maybe a sliver of hope. Emma came into the room and wrapped her arms around me. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But at least he said he's sorry. That's more than I ever thought I'd get." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. Whether or not we could rebuild our relationship remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, it felt like there was a chance. After my dad left, his words lingered in my mind like a song I couldn't stop replaying. The vulnerability in his voice, the regret in his eyes, it wasn't something I'd ever seen from him before. For years, I'd built him up in my mind as this immovable figure, someone who never admitted fault, never showed weakness. But now, I wasn't so sure. That evening, as I sat in the living room with Emma, I couldn't help but bring it up. "Do you think he really means it?" I asked, staring down at the cup of tea in my hands. Emma set her book aside and looked at me thoughtfully. "I think people can change," she said. "It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't erase the past, but it's possible. Maybe this is his way of trying to make things right. I don't know if I can trust that, I admitted. What if he's just saying what he thinks I want to hear? Emma reached over and placed her hand on mine. I don't think that's the case, she said gently. He wouldn't have come all this way if he didn't mean it. But the only way you'll know for sure is if you give him a chance to prove it. Her words made sense, but the idea of opening that door again still made me uneasy. Letting him in meant risking disappointment, and I wasn't sure if I could handle that. The next day, I decided to call Rachel. If anyone could offer some perspective, it was her. She picked up after a few rings, her voice chipper as always. Hey, stranger. What's up? I need to talk to you about Dad, I said, skipping the small talk. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What about him? She asked cautiously. He showed up at my house the other day, I said. He said he wants to reconnect, that he's sorry for everything. Wow, Rachel said, her tone surprised. I didn't know he was planning that. Do you think he's serious? I asked. Or is this just another empty gesture? Rachel hesitated before answering. Look, I know Dad's made a lot of mistakes, and I know you have every right to be skeptical. But I think he's really struggling. Struggling how? I asked, frowning. She sighed. He's not as invincible as he used to be. He's been talking a lot about the past lately, about regrets and things he wishes he'd done differently. I think he knows he's getting older, and it's making him realize how much he's missed out on. Her words caught me off guard. My dad had always seemed larger than life, strong, confident, and unshakable. The idea of him reflecting on his own mortality was almost surreal. Do you think he's capable of changing? I asked. I think so, Rachel said. But it's not going to be easy. He's set in his ways, and he's not great at expressing himself. But I think he really does want to make amends. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part of me was still stuck in the past, clinging to the resentment I'd carried for so long. Thanks, Rachel, I said finally. I'll think about it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Rachel's words played over and over in my mind. He's not as invincible as he used to be. Maybe this is his way of trying to make amends. I realized that I'd always seen my dad through the lens of my own hurt and disappointment. I'd built him up as this unreachable authority figure, someone who should have had all the answers but never seemed to care enough to share them. But what if I'd been wrong? What if he wasn't some invincible figure, but a flawed human being who had made mistakes just like anyone else? The thought didn't erase the pain, but it shifted something in me. For the first time, I started to see him not as the man who had let me down, but as a person trying to find his way, just like I was. The next morning, as I got Ethan ready for daycare, I caught myself wondering what it would mean for him to have a relationship with his grandfather. Could my dad be a better grandparent than he'd been a father? Was it worth giving him the chance to try? I still didn't have all the answers, but I was starting to realize that forgiveness wasn't just about him. It was about me too. Holding on to the anger and resentment was exhausting, and it was keeping me from fully embracing the life I'd built with Emma and Ethan. Maybe it was time to let go, not for his sake, but for mine. After days of turning it over in my mind, I called my dad and suggested we meet for coffee. I told myself it was just a conversation, not a commitment, but my stomach was in knots as I sat at the cafe waiting for him to arrive. The idea of letting him back into my life felt both hopeful and terrifying. He walked in a few minutes late, looking slightly out of place in his neatly pressed jacket and worn loafers. He spotted me, gave a small, hesitant wave, and made his way to the table. Thanks for meeting me, he said as he sat down, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. I figured it was worth a conversation. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence felt heavy, but I wasn't about to make it easier for him. If he wanted this chance, he needed to earn it. I've been thinking a lot about what I said to you the other day, he began, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and about the things I didn't say. I wasn't there for you in the way I should have been, and I can't tell you how much I regret that. I studied his face, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all I saw was a man who looked tired and worn down by his own guilt. You've said that before, I replied, my tone measured. But words don't mean much without actions to back them up. He nodded, acknowledging my point. You're right, he said, and I know I can't undo the past. But I want to try to make things better, if you'll let me. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. He talked about his regrets, admitting that he'd always been harder on me than on Rachel because he thought I didn't need the same kind of attention. You were always so independent, he said. I thought I was doing you a favor by pushing you to stand on your own, but I see now that I was wrong. You deserved my support just as much as she did. Hearing those words was both validating and painful. It felt like a small crack in the wall I'd built around myself, but it also stirred up memories of all the times I'd wished he'd been there for me. He opened up about his insecurities, something I never thought I'd hear from him. I didn't know how to be a father, he admitted. My own dad was distant, and I guess I ended up repeating some of those patterns without even realizing it. By the time I saw what I'd done, I didn't know how to fix it. It wasn't easy to hear him talk about his struggles, but it gave me a new perspective on the man I'd spent so much of my life resenting. For the first time, I saw him not as an authority figure or a source of disappointment, but as a flawed, vulnerable person who was trying to do better. As the conversation went on, we reminisced about the few good moments we'd shared. He brought up the time he taught me how to ride a bike, how he'd run alongside me, holding the seat until I found my balance. I thought my legs were going to give out, he said with a small chuckle. But seeing the look on your face when you took off on your own made it all worth it. I smiled despite myself, remembering that day clearly. It had been one of the few times I'd felt like he was truly proud of me. For the first time, it felt like we were meeting as equals, not as a father and son weighed down by years of unresolved tension. He wasn't trying to lecture me or justify his actions. He was just a man trying to make amends. When it was time to leave, he stood and looked at me with a hopeful expression. "I'd like to do this again sometime," he said. I hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I think I'd like that too." As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but for the first time, I felt like we were making progress. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with Emma, I told her about the conversation. She smiled and reached across the table to take my hand. "It sounds like he's trying," she said. "That's more than a lot of people are willing to do." "It doesn't fix everything," I said. "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But it's a start, and that was enough for now." Rebuilding my relationship with my dad wasn't a straight line. It was more like a winding road, full of stops, starts, and unexpected detours. There were moments when I questioned if it was worth it, but there were also moments when I felt glimmers of hope, small signs that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. He started coming around more often, though he was careful not to push too hard. At first, it was just quick visits to drop off small gifts for Ethan, a book here, a toy truck there. But over time, those visits turned into longer stays. He'd sit on the floor with Ethan, helping him build block towers or chasing him around the backyard. The first time he came over for a family dinner, I could tell he was nervous. Emma had cooked a simple meal, and we sat around the table making small talk. It felt awkward at first, like we were all trying to figure out how to navigate this new version of our relationship. But as the evening went on, the tension eased, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were a family again. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, moments when I'd catch myself second-guessing his intentions. Was he really committed to making amends? Or was this just another temporary effort that would fizzle out? Those doubts lingered, but I tried to push past them. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, my dad stayed a little longer than usual. We sat on the porch with cups of coffee, the cool night air wrapping around us. "I want to thank you for giving me another chance," he said, his voice soft. "I know I didn't deserve it." "You didn't," I replied honestly, but there was no malice in my tone. But I realized that holding on to the anger wasn't helping me. It was just weighing me down. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I know I can't fix everything," he said, "and I don't expect you to forget what happened. But I hope we can keep moving forward." "Me too," I said, and for the first time, I truly meant it. As the months went by, we found a new rhythm. He became a regular presence in Ethan's life, and watching them together was bittersweet. There was a part of me that felt a pang of jealousy, wishing he'd shown the same care and attention to me when I was a kid. But there was also a part of me that felt grateful that Ethan would never know the pain of feeling overlooked or unimportant. Through it all, I learned something important. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing what happened or pretending that the pain didn't exist. Forgiveness is a choice to move forward, to let go of the resentment, and to create something new out of the broken pieces. My dad and I may never have the perfect relationship, but we're trying, and that's enough for now. He's not the invincible figure I once thought he was, nor is he the source of disappointment I'd built him up to be in my mind. He's just a man, flawed, human, and trying to do better. Looking back, I realized that family is messy and complicated, full of mistakes and misunderstandings. But it's also full of second chances, if both sides are willing to put in the effort. As I watched my dad push Ethan on the swing in the backyard one sunny afternoon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. We were far from perfect, but we were moving forward. And for the first time, that felt like enough.